Good evening. Tonight we're going to touch upon a section of the Torah known as Parashat Pinchas. Now, while this particular parsha has very little from the superficial writings of this particular parsha, which is found in Numbers, beginning from chapter 25, verse 10. And it deals primarily, so we think, with the holidays in particular, and some other few, what appears to be minor notations. And yet, the Zohar itself deals with, I think, almost every aspect of life that one can possibly dream or conceive of. Very strange how the Bible itself seems to be dealing with a select number of subjects, and yet the Zohar seems to have evolved into medicine, zoology, cosmos, holidays, everything. And I'm happy to say that the Center has finally completed the English translation of the Zohar, which heretofore has been avoided by those who have done some translation on the Zohar because they feel that this is a very difficult section of the Zohar. But we have been fortunate to overcome the obstacles. And so we are going to be discussing one small aspect of Parshat Pinchas. It's a subject that much has been discussed about it, and yet I'm sorry to say that from a Kabbalistic point of view, I think so little is known about the subject. I have always refrained from discussing this particular subject at length for no other reason that this again is one of those subjects that so much corruption has evolved concerning the subject. And it's like most of the other sections we touched in the past few sessions concerning the Jew, that from the Zoharic point of view, the opinion of what is a Jew and what became manifest of a Jew seems to be something totally different than how history portrays the Jew. The Bible does not portray the Jew in a very favorable description. And now we come to another subject which has been completely, as I feel, corrupted to the extent that it has become totally put into a frame of religiosity, and therefore, from a Kabbalistic point of view, that which becomes with an aura of religiosity doesn't seem to touch or penetrate the majority of the Jewish people who should be observing this particular precept. And I'm referring to the Shabbat. The Shabbat. I guess another reason that maybe I have hesitated to discuss Shabbat at length is because it is unlike the other holidays that come once a year. So, maybe if you're not too religious, but like Rosh Hashanah, 3 days out of the year, okay, some Jews, and I won't say all Jews, because there is a very large percentage that have no connection even with the those days of holiness referred to as the high holidays that people have no connection with. But when it comes to Shabbat, from a purely religious point of view, this is something that you're going to have to observe. I use again the terminology provided for us by conventional Judaism, that you're going to have to observe this week in and week out. In other words, it doesn't give you any breather spell like the other holidays, which only come once a year. This day comes almost every day. And I believe for that reason, because it has been totally misunderstood, that the majority of Jews today either have no connection or certainly do not observe it. Even those who might even consider themselves Orthodox would not still observe this kind. Observe, and I like that word, observe, right? Because it's a corruption there too. It does not say shomer Shabbat, does not mean observe the Shabbat. The word shomer is to watch it. It's like maybe the corruption was that really we should be sitting back like a film. Someone should have produced a film on Shabbat, and we should watch it. Because if we know something about the Hebrew language, and certainly from a Kabbalistic point of view, we will stick always to the word of the Bible. We are fundamentalists in that respect. We will not twist or change a meaning of a particular word because it suits the definition of the particular passage. But in any event, they say to observe the Shabbat, and in that respect, I've always felt that it was a very difficult subject to approach, but nevertheless, maybe the time has come, and at least we can get a meaningful interpretation. Before we get into that subject, I would like to read a particular portion of Parashat Pinchas, which in essence can almost summarize for us what Shabbat is all about. And in addition, reading of the Zohar will raise all of our levels of consciousness. So the same thing that is being discussed this evening will be understood on a higher level of consciousness. This is the power of the Zohar. It's instant. We're looking for instant relief, instant medication, instant everything. The Zohar is one of those particular remedies that I strongly suggest and urge everyone to partake of. In fact, I think this is probably about the only one that provides instant, temporary, and also permanent relief. I will quote from the Zohar, page 216 in the old edition, or of the Sulam edition, page 22. And I read as follows. Ve'elu she'enim yodim sod hazeh, and those who have no idea concerning what the whole Torah is all about, Omrim, they say, Banai chaye mizoneh, lo b'schut talui hadavar, ela b'mazal talui hadavar. Those who have no idea of what this Torah is all about will always claim that children, longevity, making the providing of bread, providing of sustenance, will not depend, in their opinion, on the zachut of the individual, but this is completely dependent upon mazal, meaning it is completely out of our jurisdiction. It completely depends on your birthday, completely depends on the position of planets, position of signs of the zodiac. There are those who maintain that. And continues the Zohar, Varei anu ro'im, But however, we see she'Avraham shara b'mazlo, Avraham, who was one of the most, I consider probably the first known astrologer, who incidentally is considered to be the author of the Sefer Yetzirah, Book of Formation, shara b'mazlo, that he saw in his mazal, in his chart, she'eno atid shi'eh lo ben, he saw that there would be no son. V'akadosh baruch hu otziu l'chutz, and he took him outside. And I already explained that in the Star Connection. I mean, like they're having a conversation, seated around a table, and the Lord tells Avram, "Why don't we go outside now, and let's observe the stars?" And so the Zohar, in that section of the Torah, explains it as he explains it here. Tzei me'atz tigninut shelcha. Remove yourself. Leave behind the maps, the influences of the cosmos, dahainu me'ashtaklut b'kochavim u'mezalot, because you have reviewed the stars on a chart, the signs of the zodiac and the planets, and you have seen, well, you've done your homework, and you've seen that from a cosmic point of view, you shall have no children. Raise yourself above the stars. Va'amalo, and he told him, Habetna hashemayma usfor et hakochavim. And he said, look to the heavens and count the stars. So shall be your children. Ad kan divrei chachamim v'tzichim lefarshem b'derech nista. And this idea has to be delved into more deeply and to be explained b'derech nistar, meaning from a metaphysical point of view. Bore. Kol briot ha'olam kodem shenitna haTorah liYisrael. Every creature, that means of all the four kingdoms, whether it was the human, the animal, vegetable, and inanimate kingdom, before revelation of Mount Sinai to the Jews, hayu teluyim b'mazal. Everything depended completely and solely upon mazal, upon the signs of the zodiac and the planets. Vafilu banim chayim umazon. That means to have children, how much money one will earn, how long an individual will live. At one time depended completely on the cosmos. Avalacha shenitna haTorah liYisrael, but once there was revelation on Mount Sinai, hotziyah me'achio shel kochavim mazalot. At that point, with the revelation of the Torah on Mount Sinai, from a potential point of view, everyone was taken out from being subjected to the rules and manipulations of the cosmos. Everyone. Zeh lamadnu me'Avraham, and this is what we have learned from Avraham, that we would no longer be subject to these influence of the cosmos. Now, what did it have to do with revelation? Why did revelation create such a change where up until revelation, everything according to the Zohar was subject to the cosmos, influences of the cosmos. Immediately upon revelation, it ceased. It ceased. And he goes on further to explain how it originated. But the reason that revelation has to do with the changing of mazal dealt with revelation. Now right here, he does not discuss except in a very, you might say, very nistar, very metaphysical, very concealed way of explaining it. But he says, Mishum zeh kol ha'osek b'Torah, anyone who deals with the Torah. Remember, we have used that expression, as the Zohar says, not one who learns the Torah, but one who deals with the Torah. Deals like a businessman. Esek comes from the word osek b'Torah is the same word that you might apply it to one who is involved in business. Esek means a business venture. One who treats the Torah as a business venture, batel mimeno hachiyuv shel kochavim mazalot. Because, says the Zohar, kedei lekayim mitzvotel. In other words, before Revelation, the Jews were not, let me use the conventional term, obligated. We do not use that word in Kabbalah, obligated, but that's the way it appears. Before the Jews were obligated, they could not touch and connect the cosmos. Immediately with Revelation, now they were obligated to do the mitzvot. Now they were removed from this influence. What does Revelation have to do with performing of the mitzvot? And the answer is quite simple. From all that we have learned in the past, that when Revelation took place, that revelation, that energy that the Jew received on Mount Sinai, that connection placed him in a level of consciousness. In other words, the mitzvot were merely channels by which it would bring the Jew to a level of consciousness by which he would now be the overseer of the planets and the stars. He would become the manipulator of planets and signs of the zodiac, rather than the signs of the zodiac were to be manipulators over mankind and over everything that existed. And one who does not esek b'Torah, one who does not treat this Torah as something of a business venture, and we'll get to the point of why he associates the Torah as an esek, He says that individual, vaday shelo nitvatel mehem achiyu mikochavim umazalot, those people who cannot achieve that level of consciousness by which they can now become the rulers over their own destiny, rather than be ruled and have faith and be destined by the signs of the cosmos. This individual who could not interpret, who could not deal with the Torah on that level of consciousness, he will always be subjected to what has been preordained. So from this emerges the idea that there is free will and there is preordained fate and destiny. Both can be possible. And what does it depend upon? Where you will be, where you place yourself. The revelation of Mount Sinai were channels by which we could now raise ourselves above the influences. And if we do not know how to raise ourselves above the influences of the Kochavim u'Mazalot, then we shall be subjected in every respect. Our total life will be a preordained cassette. Therefore, to understand the aspect of Shabbat, we shall first go to the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, where it says, and I quote the following, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy."
Rabbi, I just ask one question. Does that mean also that we didn't have free will before the revelation?
That is correct. The only ones who had free will were those who were chariots, The peoples of the world, says the Zohar, did not have free will, except for the chariots. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Aaron. Therefore, it might also explain for us, if we're touching on that Jacob observed the Torah before it was given. All of the chariots, meaning all of the patriarchs, it says, both in the Midrash and the Talmud, they observed the Torah before it was given. Not the nations of Israel, not anybody else. They did. Why? What does it mean they performed the precepts? If there was no reason to perform, there was no obligation to perform, why did they perform these? God didn't ask them. What's that?
Free choice. They don't want choice.
But there was no Torah to be had.
But they were connected to it.
That's the answer. Because they were chariots. In other words, within the idea that when the Talmud, in actually hinting that because they were chariots, they were already connected to that level of consciousness by which the Torah would bring them to. They were automatically within that frame of reference.
What about Noah?
What about Noah? Noah, they say the same thing.
No, I mean the people that were vanished in the Mabul. Why were they punished?
No, why were they punished? It was simple, because they were evil people and they were punished. The question...
They had no free choice. Yeah.
You mean they were destined?
Yes.
No. Now, let's say, when I said here three things, or the Zohar mentions three things specifically. However, Revelation said that now, if you perform these precepts, you will have achieved that higher level of consciousness. The Noahide mitzvot, which there were 7. And so, they did have free will to perform or connect with the 7 mitzvot of Noah, of that period. That's why it was given, so that destruction of the world would not be fair. Why should these people, if they had no free will, suffer the consequence of a deluge, of a complete annihilation? The answer was that they had these 7 mitzvot, which were sufficient enough for them. In other words, if they did not kill, and etc. of the 7 mitzvot, would have brought them to that frame of reference, and 7 would have been enough.
So they did have a free will.
Yes, that's right.
In other words,
What
there's
about
a difference
Noah?
in free will?
What's that? Because if their level of consciousness was of such a higher nature that the 7 mitzvot was all they needed to achieve that higher level of consciousness, which would permit them free will.
All right, but what about Noah? Was he on the same level as the other chariots?
Wasn't a chariot.
But he was called a tzaddik, and once he was called a tzaddik, he was not the chariot for tzaddik. I don't want to go into what was the difference between Yosef HaTzaddik, Joseph the righteous, or Noah the righteous. What was the difference? Because these are the 2 people by which the term tzaddik is associated with. However, we know, according to the Zohar, that the word tzaddik means yesod. In other words, and we could spend a session just on that aspect, the difference between Noah and Joseph. I don't want to do that tonight. However, suffice to say that the fact that he was tzaddik, meaning he was a Irampin, so he was connected with the outer space connection. Yesod, and all of Zeirampin is part of the outer space connection. So that would permit Noah to be at that level. But he was not the chariot for Yesod.
Well, though it seems that he was the potential for what Yosef was. And probably what all of them were, because he came way before all of them.
All right, now,
I'd like to see.
the question that you might raise, and that will coincide a little of what you've just said, why were there once 7 mitzvot? And then the necessity of an additional 606, right? In other words, on the revelation of Mount Sinai was not 613 precepts, but 606 additional ones. Why at that time was 7 sufficient, and when it came to the time of the Exodus, And the answer is really included within the sessions of the last couple of sessions, in that the Jews now, all of those Jews, meaning the klipot that came down, the Erev Rav, at the fall of Adam, became revealed when? At the time of the Exodus. They were there at the time of the deluge and at the time of the Tower of Babel. However, not in that force of evil as the Jew of the Exodus. So we're picturing the Jew of the Exodus in its most ungraceful picture that we can. But in any event, let us return now to this aspect of Shabbat.
Briefly on what were those 7 mitzvot?
What's that?
The 7 mitzvot.
The 7 mitzvot were, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not eat of a limb of an animal. What's that? Of a living animal. In other words, at that time you were not permitted just to take a leg off an animal and roast it and eat it, of a living animal. How many did we say that was? 4, not 5? 5.
There was no I am the God.
What's that? No.
Praising God.
What's that?
Praising God.
Well, there was no concept. There was no concept of God yet, actually. So, but
Idols.
the aspect that it should not be idol worshiping, whatever that means. And I'm not even to this day, I'm not completely clear on what that means. It was only up until Abraham where monotheism came into existence. He was the first believer. What did that mean? What about Noah? We're getting into another subject. I mean, what was Noah? He talked to God. He believed in God. And yet, the one who's considered to be the first Jew, and again, I'd have to explain what does it mean, the first Jew, but the first one who believed in monotheism. Because he was chesed, and I discussed that to some extent in Kabbalah connection, but we would be getting off. All right. Getting back to this, it says, "Thou shalt keep the Shabbat holy." Then the Sabbath, to keep it holy, to keep that day holy. You shall work 6 days of the week. And on the 7th day, you shall rest. Biki sheshet yamim asa Hashem et hashemayim ve'et haaretz et hayam and everything. Because on the 7th day, the Lord rested. 6 days he worked, but on the 7th day he rested. Therefore he blessed this day and he made it holy. Because he rested, he made it holy. The first discrepancy that we shall find, and this is within the 10 Commandments, is the idea that God rested on the 7th day. And we have this, I think we have touched upon this occasionally, where it says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. And on the 7th day, the Lord finished his work. It doesn't say on the 6th day he finished his work. He says he finished his work on the 7th day. And he rested in the 7th day. Now, within the same verse too, there's a contradiction. Either he finished his work on that day, then he obviously did not rest that day. If he finished his work, maybe he was only a part-time worker, and so he just worked an hour or two on the 7th day, but it says He finished his work in the seventh day. And on the seventh day, he rested. And then, of course, I've always raised the question because he got tired, and we can understand why he got tired. I mean, creating universes, heaven and earth, would require a great deal of effort, and therefore he rested. But why would we have to rest, since maybe we're on pensia, like they'd say in Israel, or we're retired, we're not really working, and there are those people who don't work so hard? Would they, in effect, have to keep the Shabbat? All right? So, that doesn't seem right. And there have been other explanations given of the Shabbat, poor explanations in my opinion, and that is everyone needs a rest, right? And so God's resting on the seventh day was to indicate to us that, you see, you can't keep going, you can't be a workaholic, you've got to rest at least one day of the week. Now, what does it mean work? Does it mean the same kind of work that the Lord performed in the 6 days of the week? And if it meant for rest, then why can't we rest on the third day of the week, the fourth day of the week? I might even add that if anyone has ever been present at our Shabbat, when I claim that I work one day of the week and I rest 6 days of the week, and that is on Shabbat, I'm exhausted. And that permits me the other 6 days to take a vacation. Would that mean I'm completely in conflict with what it says here? 6 days the Lord worked, and on the seventh day he rested. And as you know, in every day of the week, it says, Vayera Vayiboke Yom Echad, Yom Sheni. It says each day there was day and night. And on this particular day of Shabbat, it doesn't say at the end of the section. It completes the description of Shabbat in verse 3 of chapter 2, and I will read it for you, because, again, this doesn't sound too good. And the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because that in it he rested from all his work which God in creating had made. It does not say at the end, as it does in all of the other 6 days of creation, and there was evening and there was morning, the seventh day. That is omitted. Let us even observe now what it says here. For the word resting, it says, Vayishbot. Vayishbot bayom hashvi'i. And he rested. Remember the word rested. In fact, if you know Hebrew, and this term is very well known in Israel, Vayishbot, it comes from the word shvita. You know, in Israel, every other week they have a strike. So the word for shvita, strike is shvita. Now, we might even be under the misconception that maybe God went on strike the seventh day. But the reason I raised that question, and it might sound a little funny, and yet I'm very serious, because let us jump now back to Exodus 20 and the Ten Commandments, verse number 11. And it says, For in the 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and he rested in the seventh day. You know what the day for, and you know what it says for resting, the Hebrew word? Not vayishbot, vayanach bayom hashvi'i. and he rested. Now in Hebrew, the word for resting is nach. How come? How come it doesn't say the same? How come in the Ten Commandments it does not repeat the same inference for resting in the Ten Commandments as mentioned in the creation of the seventh day, where it says Vayishbot Bayom Hashvi'i Mikol Malachto. Does not say Nach. And more to home, we might raise the question: if Shabbat is in essence a day that one should rest, what constitutes rest? And here is where I have found any explanation of rest to mean literally a day of rest, not working. You may not be aware of this halakha, but if one has an air conditioning running in his home with a temperature outside of 110, and accidentally someone should flip the switch to the off position of the air conditioner, he is not permitted to resume the operation of that air conditioner. However, the women in the house, if they have 640 guests, and there's a lot of serving to be done, a lot of washing of dishes, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Now, how do we reconcile the fact that even a waiter is permitted to perform his duties on Shabbat, and yet we're not permitted to flip a switch? How do you reconcile both? If, in essence, the subject that is being dealt with is because God rested. Because God rested. And I considered the most important question. It says God blessed this day. What do you mean he blessed this day? What does it mean he blessed it? He was tired. He rested. Why would he want to bless this day more than any other day? Why should this day be blessed and not the first day or second day? Weren't they all of a phenomenal nature to produce something that didn't exist before? There was no heavens, there was no earth, there were no stars, no animals, no man. Those were days that he should have blessed the world. And yet the day that he doesn't perform any chore, any form of work, that's the day he decided to bless it. And it winds, and the verse concludes itself with Vaikatsheu. So the first subject that I believe we should be dealing with is what is work? What is work? Now, even the term labor, there is something called the labor of love. There is work that, as I think it is known in business, that 90% of all people who are active in whatever they're doing would rather be doing something else. But for monetary or financial reasons, they persist and remain where they are. But they have to work, because without working, how else can you make a living? And this is what they know best, or this is where they can exact the greatest form of remuneration. That is work. That is work. Another form of work. Work that you despise. The Zohar says in Parshat Bereshit, and gives us a definition of what is worked. When we raise the question, how come in all of the other days it says, Vayera Vayiboker, and on the seventh day it doesn't say that, and it says that he finished his work on the seventh day? The Zohar provides us with an interpretation of what it is meant by Vayera Vayiboker. Erev, says the Zohar briefly, means negativity. Left column. Boker means right column. In other words, not that he created Boker, not that he created morning, because we would then have to raise the question, another serious question in Genesis. When did he create the sun and the moon? On the fourth day. To give you the verse, in chapter 14 in Genesis, verse 14, chapter 1, it says, and let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night. That means, on the fourth day, came the development of night and day. Yet, on the first day already, it says, and God referred to the light as day, and to the night he referred to, and to the darkness as night. And therefore there was day and night. How could there be day and night if there was no sun and no moon? Could there be day and night? How do we reconcile the Vayera Vayiboker? Therefore, and that's the question the Zohar raises, and the answer is simple enough, that we are to treat these words of Erev and Boker not as night, or not as evening, and not as morning, but rather as all of Genesis was dealing not with any physical manifestations, but purely metaphysical energy intelligences. Pure energy intelligences. Which means that Erev meant negative. He created negative energy intelligences because there was no light yet. And it says, in fact, if we go back to verse 3 of Genesis 1, it says, and the Lord said, let there be light, and there was light. Then what was the sun about? We think that the sun is what provides light for this universe. And yet, on the first day of creation, it says, and the Lord said, let there be light, and there was light. Contradiction. The answer, says the Zohar, we are not discussing here neither the sun or the moon, neither are we discussing light as we understand it, but everything in a purely refined, metaphysical thought energy intelligence. When he said light, he meant the aspect of let there be sharing. Right column. That is Yom. When he said Vahi Erev, he was referring to the aspect of desire to receive. Simple enough. So we are not discussing in Genesis 1 anything of a physical corporeal nature. Nothing. Therefore, all of these days it says Vahi Erev, Vahi Boker. No. That on these 6 days of the week, there are always two forces. Forces that are not, from a physical, corporeal sense, recognizable, but they exist in the cosmos. There are forces of negativity, and there are forces of positivity. Know that only on the 6 days of the week do these two opposite, opposing forces conflict with each other, and each one is in total inharmony, meaning each one wants to always control and rule over the other. Then you might ask, what was the purpose? What was the purpose of the sun and the moon and all of the signs of the zodiac? If we are in essence saying that there are just two sources of movement, two energy intelligences, negative and positive, what was all this motion about? To tell us that this positive aspect and this negative aspect that was placed into this universe on a metaphysical basis became manifested different ways, in different ways. That means the sun, as an example, has a positive aspect to it, and it also has a negative aspect. That's why it says Vahier Vaiboka. In other words, everything that we confront with during the 6 days of the week, those two opposing forces, they are not evil, they are not positive, but they are two opposing forces in the cosmos, one desirous of ruling over the other, like in fourth day. And I don't want to, we've discussed the differences between the first three and the second three. They are symbolic of the Magen David. They are symbolic of the Shield of David, meaning the upper is called purely potential, and the lower three are called metaphysical in an actual manifested state. Not physical, because nothing of a physical nature came in Genesis 1. Remember, Genesis 2, we've discussed this before, and I don't want to go through that again. Genesis 2 was where Adam became a physical, corporeal body from the earth. Everything else became physically manifested. In the 6 days of creation, we are discussing pure energy intelligences of positive and negative that became manifested. How did they become manifested? In the way of sfirot, bottled up energies. But there are only principally two, positive and negative. Now on the third day, we know he created what we refer to as the central column, restriction. These forces in the cosmos operate 6 days of the week. 6 days of the week. How they become manifest is the way all of us are going to behave. And so if you notice, some days the market goes up, and some days the market goes down. Some days there's a tremendous amount of buying. Some days there's a tremendous amount of selling. Would you in good conscience say that all the people, the millions of people involved in the market, had a meeting each and every single day, and this day they decided to buy? On another day, all these stockholders decided to sell. Is that rational? No. How do you explain? All of a sudden, the market goes up, they're selling. If you listen to the brokers, they have the answer every day. They'll tell you why it went up today, and tomorrow they'll tell you the opposite and tell you why it went down. So they are obviously not so reliable. But how do you explain that all people came to the same conclusion, to either sell or to buy? The answer lies in the fact that there are influences in the cosmos that are directing most, if not almost all, of the inhabitants of planet Earth. That happened in Genesis 1. And therefore, when Revelation came about, of which Shabbat was included, Shabbat was not included. Shabbat was not included as the seventh day mentioned in Genesis. There we're talking about creation. We're not talking about a mitzvah. If that was already a mitzvah, if the seventh day of creation was the mitzvah of Shabbat, then there would have been 8 mitzvot. Not only the Jew, but everyone should have been observing the Shabbat. Why suddenly in the 10 Commandments the Jew is told, and we should listen to again the verse clearly, you Jews have now an obligation to observe Shabbat. Why? Vayana bayom hashvi, because God created 6 days. In those 6 days he created heaven and earth and so on and so forth. And so most people relate this mitzvah, as it appears on a superficial basis, to be dealing with the 7th day of creation. How else can you interpret when the verse says, for in the 6 days of the week, God created heaven and earth, the seas, and everything that was contained within them. And on the seventh day, he rested. And everyone alludes this verse to creation. If the creation of the seventh day, if the seventh day was then creation of Shabbat, then everyone should have become observant, or the precept of Shabbat should have begun not with revelation, but it should have begun with creation. And yet we know there were only 7 mitzvot. This was not a precept. Then why does the precept in the 10 Commandments concerning Shabbat refer back to Genesis? To say because he rested during those days, therefore, now. That was there before. Creation of the seventh day, creation of rest, supposedly, was there before. Why now a new precept? Because the answer is, just as the 6 days we said were cosmically established as Sfirot, so too the 7th day was a cosmic event that was established. What was this cosmic event? What was this cosmic event? And he uses the word Vayishbot. You remember that was a question we raised before. Vayishbot, he rested. I like the word better, Shvita. You know what Shvita means? A strike. What does a strike mean? You have a job to do. And on that day, you strike. You are not going to perform those duties that have to be performed. Isn't that really, in essence, what a strike is about? How else would you interpret strike? Today, I'm going to protest. I'm not going to do my job. I don't see any other way of clearly defining just what shvita means.
Hopefully with getting paid for it.
What's that?
Hopefully with getting paid for it.
Maybe yes, maybe no. You could be laid off. After strikers have been laid off and never returned to their former job, right? When it says that God created and that he finished his work in the 7th day, it means he worked on the 7th day. There is no way of twisting those words. He worked on the 7th day. He worked on the 7th day.
Otherwise, the 7th day would never have been created.
What's that?
How could you have a 7th day if it didn't work?
How could you have a 7th day if he didn't work? I never thought about that, but that's beautiful.
Then Shabbat would be on the 6th day.
That's right. That's right. I mean, how does a concept of 7th day come about? There should have only been 6 days. And then you might even say, why didn't the Sunday begin after Shabbat? I mean, he didn't do anything that day. So did he create a space or vacuum? I mean, what did he do? If there was nothing there, he didn't create anything, then why didn't Sunday begin? Which is, I think, the idea you're printing, right? Okay. The answer is he worked. And not in terms of working, but just as the first 6 days dealt with the creation of metaphysical forces, energy intelligences, on the 7th day, he also created that kind of concept. On the 7th day, remember we also said, it says by Kadeshoto, and he made it holy. What does it mean he made it holy? How does he make it holy? How do you make things holy? Well,
by creating a full circuit.
What's that?
By creating.
In other words, he created a full circuit. All right? That's if we understand, which we do understand, that the word by Kadesh is not a word meaning H-O-L-Y, wherever that came from. No, you can sprinkle water on someone's head, he becomes holy, right? Or things of that nature. Is that what he did on that day? Sprinkled a couple of drops on the day? What does it mean he made it holy? How does he make it holy? What? That would be a very good explanation. And that's exactly what he did on the seventh day. Whereas all 6 days, it states clearly, Vayera Vayiboker, that there was evening, or meaning there was a negative energy intelligence that was created on that day, and they were subdivided into 6 different sfirot. And he also created Boker, the positive energy force, and during the 6 days, they were always in conflict with each other. On the seventh day, he created, or what does it mean he created? He injected the force of restriction, the force of an automatic restriction, no less than when General Electric inserts the filament within the bulb to maintain or create circuitry of energy, meaning the filament has no free will. The filament has a job to do. It has the bulb has an automatic inbuilt force of restriction called the filament, and therefore, by merely flipping the switch, no effort, by merely flipping the switch, the filament is placed into motion and you have an automatic circuit. On the seventh day, he worked, meaning he took these 2 forces that were created on every other day of the week and he injected from the part of the cosmos, from the part of the creator, he injected the force, the natural force of restriction, which we call the third column, and by virtue of injecting that kind of creation, on the seventh day, there was another kind of cosmos created. Whereas in the first 6 days, there was positive and negative, and they were always to be in conflict. On the seventh day, he created a phenomena different than the first 6 days. He injected this neutralizer, the neutron, you might say, into the cosmos, in which the balance between right and left was initiated and established. That was creation. What's that?
How was that done? How was the neutron injected?
He created, that's what he did on Shabbat, meaning he created the neutron. He created a force that stabilizes, that creates symmetry, a force that creates balance. Okay, I'll get back to it. It was automatic.
Wasn't that same force created on Tuesday?
What?
Isn't Tuesday similar to the neutron?
Good question. Why did he pick out on this day to make it holy, or to create that kind of God? Why didn't he do it, let's say, the third day?
Yeah, right.
Okay, good question.
I think the third day has it's from day 1, which is the positive, Yom Rishon. Yom Sheni would become negative if you take into that week as a group of, and then Tuesday, Tamayim Kitov, because it contains the restricting part.
So did he inject that symmetry in the third day?
No, not into the day itself, but into the week as a whole.
You're touching on something. All right, we'll continue. We'll continue after a short break.